There will never be another game like Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy had flourished into the JRPG series during the Super Nintendo era, arguably, telling stories with groundbreaking levels of style and impact. They redefined turn-based combat, transforming the affair into an active back and forth, constantly pushing the boundaries of what was possible within the genre. The series had become a technical powerhouse, a showcase of what could be done when no punches were pulled. So it was obvious that when it was necessary, the series would jump ship to the console, pulling no punches. Final Fantasy VII was the first Final Fantasy for a lot of people. It was on a new platform with a new group of players to make fans, especially if you were in Europe, and boy, did it ever just go absolutely insane. Once again, the series found a way to press onward and redefine what it could be. 3D models, more explosions, more character drama, nail-biting cinematography. I mean, this is blowing my mind right now. New strange combat mechanics and progression systems, arguably the most memorable opening act to an RPG, the biggest, most impactful key moment in franchise history. Final Fantasy VII exploded onto a new scene, doing things that had never been seen before, defining the series' future as a bright one, and standing as a landmark release both for the series and for Square. So it goes without saying that there will never be another game like the Final Fantasy VII Remake. This is a strange intro, I'm well aware. I'm also aware of the bodies under your floorboards. They're aware of you too. Final Fantasy VII is a very interesting game, one that I played during my early childhood, but never got super far into. This era of Final Fantasy is great, but it's not the most welcoming for those who are too short to turn on their television or read. The Remake, on the other hand, is a title I was head over ham excited for. When I finally got my grubby little mitts on and I walked away, right in the middle of the final boss. I don't know, I just got stuck and gave up. I don't really know how I let myself do that, but it wasn't for a lack of entertainment value. I think it was more due to some extended breaks during my playthrough that killed my momentum. For as better as I am nowadays with my completion of games, this is still a struggle that plagues me with RPGs. I know, sue me, but just keep in mind. Oh. A couple of things made a really remarkable impact on me during that first playthrough. First off, eyes. This game makes me go positively outrageous. I've never been a big fan of hyper-realistic graphical styles because in nearly every case, a straight-up attempt at realism falls directly into the uncanny valley, and the tiny improvements made over the years never really makes that any better. But 7R goes for a very realistic yet still slightly stylized look for its main cast. This is able to seamlessly bleed the realistic textures and skin imperfections with the bigger eyes and stupid hair. The expressions on the models, man, the slight changes in demeanor throughout conversations really allows for a lot of character emotion to be portrayed just through what we see. Now, mind you, the mainline Final Fantasies had been tackling realism for like a decade, but 7R did it best to a pretty extreme degree. The other thing that really stood out to me in regards to my ocular regions had to do with the setting of Midgar itself. This two-tiered pizza city with grimy slums, sun lamps, and towering support pillars, topped off by Detroit. I was personally super excited to see more of Midgar because it's gotta be one of the most interesting settings for a gameplay segment the RPG landscape has ever seen. This remake does a great job of establishing the dichotomy between the ground-level slums and the plate residential districts, while making the whole affair feel overwhelmingly huge, even though in reality this game is quite small, and you don't really get to see much of it. However, graphical oddities are way more common here than they should be. Low-quality NPCs, broken textures, the vast majority of Midgar being a skybox, which results in questionable vistas, to say the least. So visually, you're gonna have to mix that bag up a little bit. In regards to combat, I really like how they mixed the modern action gameplay with the active time battle system of the original. It works well. Having free reign over one character, then stopping the fight to issue commands to the others is a really good balance between action and turn-based combat. I was remarkably horrendous at it. Couple this with the whole never beating the final boss thing, and alongside 2 months passing and this video being made completely irrelevant, I felt like I needed to play through the Final Fantasy VII Remake one more time to brace myself for the rise of Satan into our poor world. So I sat down and I started playing. And I played like half the game in one sitting. It was in that moment that I realized something. My whole life, I've been the fried chicken at the Mexican grill. I'm not bad, but nobody wants me. I decided to save that for a second channel. So I sat down, finished up my vodka, and began to realize something else. Playing through the Final Fantasy VII Remake makes me feel a certain way that I never feel when playing another game. It's something about the core experience, how it tackles balancing its legacy along forging its own identity, how it progresses from point A to point B, its valiant attempts at deepening the personalities of its cast into characters that can carry a story previously occupying 6 hours of a larger experience. My head goes around and around and around, and I'm not an owl, so we have to figure this thing out. This isn't an exaggeration either. The Final Fantasy VII Remake makes me feel a certain way that no other game has ever been able to capture. And mind you, I've played quite a few games in my life, so these words carry about a kilogram of steel worth of weight. That's heavy. So let's sit down, put our brains in gear, and figure out why. First off, why doesn't? The first reason that is not a reason that I feel a certain way about the 7 Remake, the anticipation. I had my knickers on the line waiting for this one. That's right. They weren't even on. But I anticipate many things. That doesn't mean I immediately have a magical attachment to it. I patiently awaited Star Ocean 6, Tears of the Kingdom, Kingdom Hearts 3, Geometry Dash 2.2 for like half of my gosh dang life. All of these things I feel a fairly average way about. I don't have a severe attachment to them. I don't hold them in a separate spot in my memory. I do with this fella, though. Now, the wait to this game was insane, like, almost as long as I've been alive, but I didn't care until the actual announcement proper. The weeks leading up to the release were ones of particular hype that had much to do with a demo of the opening chapter that showed how good the game was going to be from a hype standpoint, but, like, I've been more excited for things and felt less passionate about them in the end. Final Fantasy VII-R isn't special because of my anticipation. My view isn't being clouded by a desire not to accept disappointment. This is further backed up by the second reason that I don't feel a certain way about 7-R. It's bad. Because it is not. 7-R shook the RPG landscape when it dropped. The presentation shattered what people expected. And while I've already mentioned how that was kind of a mixed little bag of Cheerios, it can't be understated just how good this game looks when it really, really needs to. A lot of that being the stellar animation and lighting during key moments in dungeons. But to take a well-known, loved story and expand it in the way it was expanded here is simply unheard of. It changes just enough to be fresh, while still delivering all the most important story beats of Midgar from the original title. Combat is fun, the enemy design is dynamic, and while the entire affair is kinda grounded and moves at a slow pace, that means that the combat predominantly sticks to a mold that's pretty hard to mess up. It's a game that if you go at its speed and pick up what it puts down, it's pretty easy to enjoy. Even though, the third reason I don't feel a special way about the 7 Remake is that it's too good. Because from a certain perspective, a very nitpicky and critical view, it's kind of a face full of zits, with a bomb strapped to its chest. I've never played a game that paces itself like 7-R does. So much downtime and character moments that I genuinely care about, laid out in a manner that makes every important story beat feel like a million years apart. So much happens, yet so little happens. It's a paradoxical nightmare that traps me in my head at social gatherings and hours in the therapist's chair. Furthermore, side content runs majorly dry in the creative department very fast, and while there isn't a ton of it, it's placed throughout the story in such a strange way that your party is stripped back to 4 members, the 4 that you meet in Midgar outside of this little fella right here. And this is fine, this is absolutely how they should have handled it, but they come and go in such a strange way. A relic of the original that is now ballooned to a huge problem when an hour of game is stretched to 6, 7 hours. These words are hard to put into words, evident by how bad these words are flowing when words tend to flow better than these words do. But to put it simply, I'm not seeing the Final Fantasy VII Remake through a preferential lens due to the hype. It's not a disaster, and it's far from perfect. So I've painted a bit of a picture here. The reason I feel the Final Fantasy VII Remake is so special is not anything surface level. It has nothing to do with my personal attachment to the game, nor does it strictly have to do with quality. Something about the experience of 7-R makes it stand wholly by itself among its contemporaries. And I think I may just have figured it out. Fried chicken does not originate from Mexico. It's kind of just like around a lot, much like an uncle who's lame. But there are also a handful of reasons as to why this game is set apart in my mind. A lot of it is actually very heavily structural, so first off, let's establish, what is the Final Fantasy VII Remake, and what exactly happens in it? The game opens up on a sweeping shot of the city of Midgar, a two-tiered industrial city powered by massive reactors that run off of an energy source known as Mako. This will be the setting for the entire story, and the first 6 or so hours of the original PS1 title. The scene then focuses in on a small ego terrorist group known as Avalanche breaking into one of said reactors to blow it up. This plays out from the perspective of Cloud, a hired mercenary and ex-soldier, which is an elite military group of Shinra, the company in charge of Midgar. Having been taken on because of his ties to Tifa, one of Avalanche's members, he spearheads the offensive and they successfully blow up the reactor and escape, with some Shinra corporate meddling to make the explosion more damaging, thus hurting Avalanche's public image even more so than exploding a nuclear reactor already would. The game then proceeds down the same path the original Final Fantasy VII did, Cloud being pulled into the Avalanche's affairs more and more, until he gets separated during a big mission, meets a girl named Aerith who had previously given him a flower he had then regifted to another girl like an absolute Chad. Events happen, dare I say more than a couple of times. They have to save each other's behinds every so often. The game then completely explodes in the last hour and a half like most JRPGs do. You shove some serious expansion into the whole affair and bam, 30 or so hours milked from a tutorial arc. Right out of the gate, we're introduced to the first reason this game is so extremely impactful in a unique way, and it's this opening act is a beat-for-beat recreation of the original. What better way to establish the technical improvements than to present to us that original iconic opening act with a modern life breathed into every detail? What we see in the first 45 seconds of the game puts to shame what the PS1 original had to show. Cloud's side flip off the train straight into battle is genuinely one of the coolest introductions for a main character ever. Throughout the next 45 minutes to an hour of gameplay, every fundamental aspect of combat is introduced with enough guidance to make it easily applicable, but also with the wiggle room to experiment a bit. The brevity and effectiveness of the tutorials perfectly display the similarities and differences from the original turn-based combat system while maintaining the fast, frenetic pace this act needs to carry. By itself, this opening act would have been phenomenal, but as a recreation of something that was already so memorable, breathing more personality into the side characters and quieter moments, hints players into the sense of scale that has been brought to the previously brief Midgar section of the Final Fantasy VII story. It comes off as both comforting and warm, while also exciting and engaging. We may already know what the main story beats will be comprised of as a remake, but who knows what exciting, impactful new characters and events will be inserted into it. Upon first playthrough, this opening act leaves a truly unique mark. Upon repeat playthroughs, the mastery of its structure begins to show. Crafting both nostalgia and excitement for the new is something most games by nature will never be able to do, and it's why this opening act is so unique. It's a structural thing, down to the very core of this game's being. And at no point does the game ever stop impressing like this. This premier production quality, seeing such a memorable opening act leap from the confines of the PS1 into a glorious HD, explosive action movie, that impact is consistently recreated every single time that it needed to be. Take the Airbuster fight, for example. This guy was a big deal in the original. The fight is a climax to an arc. It leads into a very distinctly different chunk of game where you meet Aerith proper. It's bombastic and it's impactful. In the remake, though, it's gotta be one of the most hype moments in series history. Music was one of the things this remake needed to tackle with serious care. The soundtrack to FF7 is among the greats, and while it's aged technically, especially when you put it up against other games from that console, which, like, fair, firstborn children tend to age the worst too. Regardless of sound font, the melodies themselves are iconic. They are infinitely replicable. You hear that battle theme once, and it's your personality. I'm sorry, them's the apples. How do you like them? Interestingly enough, though, the 7 Remake doesn't use a battle theme in a traditional sense, instead choosing to do a lot with adaptive music. This blends the soundtrack seamlessly from exploration to combat, and this is probably to make the game seem more cinematic, and it works. It gets a A+ from me. It fits the rest of the experience perfectly. If we were to hear the first 15 seconds of a battle track for every fight in the game, it would be really jarring from the rest of the experience. However, this does mean that the original battle tracks aren't going to be heard very often, so the sparing uses need to be really impactful. You approach the sky bridge. Tensions high, the whole party ready for a no-holds-barred stand against Shinra, broadcast live on television. The Airbuster comes down into frame. And then,
There was no better way to implement the original boss theme. It elevates this already important boss fight into the textbook definition on how to leave a mark on the player. The Airbuster fight in the Final Fantasy VII Remake is legendary. I'm tired though, so let's take a break. Heck, government mandated. Some R&R, a light snack, maybe a little bit of exercise. 59 floors of stairs, perchance? Huh? Anyone? We're talking about the 59 flights of stairs now. One of my absolute favorite moments in the franchise is when you finally make it to the Shinra building, the climax of the Midgar arc, and you're asked to climb 59 flights of stairs, riddled with comedic dialogue and a general feeling of, wow, this game will really do anything if you hadn't already figured that out. It's great, really. It makes me smile. The goofy magic of this scene is perfectly captured in the remake, with Barrett struggling to keep up, Tifa having run way ahead, and Cloud as usual being extremely boring and unpersonable. He's so epic! New profile picture. But as you near the last few sets of steps, Cloud begins to appear drained, moving slower than before. His desire to choose the hard route as usual making a visible impact on him. It's one of the very, very few times throughout the story that you see Cloud as anything other than just perfectly stoic. It's for a brief moment, but it's a really cute bonding moment for the characters, and a great humanizing one for our protagonist. Every important moment is treated with this level of care, recreating the original experience and expanding its impact and presentation. It's a very magical feeling. With that said, this is where stuff gets really weird. If you were to take a 6-hour chunk of game, and through visual and gameplay expansion, double its length, yeah, that ain't gonna cut it. When they announced that the first entry of the Final Fantasy VII Remake project was going to be comprised solely of Midgar, the biggest question was whether or not we'd survive to see the end of all of it, but also what was going to be added in order to make a full-length game. You can't take a 6-hour experience and stretch only that into 30 hours. The notion is nauseating. Stuff needed to be added. Characters, side quests, locations, and events. Whether or not the title was able to naturally and functionally include that into the experience was integral to its success. This fact spawns one of the biggest truths that plays into Final Fantasy VII R's wholly unique identity. This game has the weirdest pacing of anything I've ever witnessed. After the initial scene in the reactor, Cloud makes his way to the Avalanche home base by himself, slipping through back streets and burning wreckage, giving us a long gameplay segment to bite down into, which was previously something short and transitory. There are a few great interactions with Jessie here, a character whose expansion was a wonderful addition, I'll add that here because I love no other place to. And there's also an extensive chase with Shinra, a great chance to see Cloud in action before going into a slower chunk of gameplay. Because afterwards, you head back to the bar, whose name is spacing me right now, so I'm gonna call it, how about 7th Heaven? Nah, Joe from Tom Petty's The Last DJ. The short rest in between reactors from the original game is now a full gameplay segment where you go around and complete odd jobs with Tifa. A lot of this is side quest stuff, mostly rudimentary tasks. However, engaging in them can result in some really charming dialogue and solid loot. These chunks of gameplay pop up a handful of times throughout the story, and are generally entirely skippable. They're very rarely notable, however, they can be fairly entertaining, and I still enjoy the chances to engage more with Midgar, getting to know the characters around you better in the meantime. After that gameplay segment, which can be as long or as short as you want, you head into a brand new story chapter designated to fleshing out Biggs, Jessie, and Wedge, the other 3 members of this splinter cell of Avalanche. This scenario sees you taking a trip up to the plate in order to grab some ingredients to make an explosive. In the process, you stop by Jessie's parents' house and learn more about the different characters' backstories and ambitions. You have a bike segment earlier than the final chapter, which is just good for pacing. Avalanche is confirmed to be a huge organization and more than a few bozos with bruised knees over the climate. Overall, this segment goes a really long way in fleshing out the characters and world of Midgar. It feels entirely integral to the story, even though it's an aside to the main quest. If I hadn't played the original, I never would have guessed that literally none of it happened. These are the 3 different ways the game expands the story of Midgar. Expansion of transitory periods into full gameplay segments, chunks of gameplay that slow the pace to allow for side quests, and brand new main missions that expand the lore. Now the problem with this is that the balancing is horribly out of whack. Every transitory period is now a gameplay segment. A walk and talk conversation, a jaunt through the train system, a trek through a collapsed highway, the entire train graveyard thing that happens. These new additions aren't a problem, but problems do begin to arise when the additions of brand new mainline story beats are few and far between. Later on in the story, you find yourself in an underground Shinra lab, a gameplay segment I really like because it gives you a chance to control Barret. But other than that and the aforementioned missions surrounding Jesse, there aren't too many brand new additions outside of the final act, which is pretty much completely different. However, that's a straight shot to the end, so it kind of barely feels like it counts. So the whole mid-game, really when you get separated from Tifa and Barret to when you reunite with them, is stretched egregiously thin. The whole point of that story segment is to get back to Sector 7 and meet up with everyone else. But you take a long back route through the junkyard, and you have to take a long walk through the highway, and then Don Corneo happens, and I don't want to talk about it. But after that, the sewers are expanded, and then the train graveyard is now a whole dungeon with important character information and new mechanics. Breathing new life into previously brief story segments is good. It's literally what the whole game is, but because this chunk of game was already a lot of get from point A to point B in the original title, this chunk of story drags on, and the large, mostly uninteresting side quest breaks right in the middle don't help. Then by the time you do meet up with everyone else and it's time to tackle more big important plot points, it gets so good again. More important story with expanded gameplay, emotional weight because of the additions from earlier, and then after that, you're slammed with the longest and most derivative chunk of side quests in the game! You're told that this is the last stop before the train really gets rolling to the end of the experience, so I don't want to stop and do all this crap. And like before, the content sheds a charming light on the world and characters, but from a pacing point of view, it's like assassination. It's too close to the previous side quest chapter, and it largely takes place in the same locations, kind of doing like the same things. And this is the only part of the story that really felt like padding, like they were grasping at straws for a way to prolong the title, and it sucks because they had done a half-decent job up to that point of avoiding that. This section of the story is capped off with a slightly different tread through the sewers with a brand new character named Leslie, a servant to Don Corneo who wants to seek revenge. You spend this chunk of the story really getting his life on a better track, an important reminder that Avalanche's challenge to authority really can bring light into people's lives, that Midgar is corrupt to the core. And even though Avalanche's actions as a terrorist group are unscrupulous at best, they're out for the betterment of the world at heart. Common Leslie W, if I might add. He's just a character from an old mobile game. This is the same guy. It's gotta be. It really does feel like the entire middle arc of 7R takes a million years to get anywhere and get anything done because of how much the transitory periods and side quests dominate the time spent in it. So while I am completing dungeons and quests and progressing the plot forward, it feels like I haven't done anything at all. I have never experienced something like this to this scale in any other game that I've ever played. It also doesn't help that the story hinders progress with roadblocks that could have been avoided if you had a jump button. That's just aggravating anywhere. So in a weird way, seeing the original Final Fantasy VII expanded to a crazy degree actually becomes frustrating, simply because of how the original game is structured. It would have been nice if some events had been shifted around or removed to avoid this problem, but then as a remake it would have suffered, so while I have all these complaints towards that chunk of the game, the only way I can think of fixing it would have been to add a new big story event in the middle to make the game feel paced less like a long walk through conveniently placed roadblocks. But that probably would have made the problem even worse. It's an issue that is tied to the simple idea of expanding upon the original sequence of events, and it would have been really weird to massively inflate all the events before and after getting separated from Avalanche and to leave that middle brisk and unchanged for the sake of a shorter runtime, because then the game just would have simply felt unfinished. Simply put, the game has a polish problem that runs down to the core of the original experience. Maybe one less chapter of side quests would have helped, but it still wouldn't have changed the fact that the entire mid-game is essentially a set of dungeons as a drawn-out means to an end. Yeah, actually, I think that's the big problem. The dungeons in the early game are terrorist attacks, and the dungeons near the end are all for a very specific purpose that I won't divulge here because I'm not an idiot, but the junkyard, the ghost train yard, and everything in between are simply, we have to walk through this to get to another place, and oops, someone stole my pelvis! Looks like we'll have to take the route with 20 active robots instead of
climbing the box in our way. To have so much of the mid-game essentially take place in between a handful of story beats is a problem that can't easily be resolved, potentially not at all. And it's not like this chunk of game hasn't been revitalized with new stuff. You have the expanded presence of the Turks. Sector 5 and Wall Market have a lot more going on than they used to. The tournament in Wall Market especially, that was a very welcome, charming addition. They even brought back the Hell House so I could finally face my fears from childhood, but it took me like an hour to beat it the first time, thus forging more fear. Maybe I should have just stuck to watching movies. However, all of these additions never really take the focus off of getting back to Sector 7. Deal with the Turks and have Aerith take you to the gate to Sector 7. Go find Tifa and Chronos mansion so you could get to Sector 7 altogether. Fight through the ghost train yard. Sector 7, it's right there. Just keep walking, guys. Come on, please. I'm not gonna pretend to know better than the devs here and claim there's some kind of easy solution for this strangely complex problem. What I will say, though, is that this super strange pacing problem wouldn't exist in any other game. When you're making a new game, story segments are far more malleable. You can move them around to fit the pacing better, or just, if you don't want them there at all, just ditch them, you know? The world's your oyster when you're not old. It's not as easy for this game to move things around or add an arc, because that could have potentially huge repercussions on the rest of the story that has already been told. This is one of the things that makes this title extremely unique. It's just not in a particularly sexy way. As a game, 7R is very good, but its biggest problem is the pacing, and it's something that isn't easily fixed, especially when you need time to flesh out the new ideas, like the ghost things that follow you around, alongside taking the time to make each character feel more attached to each other, to make their dedication to each other in the last act feel more believable. In general, I actually really like the additions to the story here, and the way they deal with the characters makes the story feel more complete as a standalone product, not just the introduction to a larger thing. This leads me to the last, far less complaint-riddled reason as to why the Final Fantasy VII Remake is unlike any other game, and it's how it handles the insurmountable legacy of Sephiroth. Sephiroth, much like Cloud, the victory fanfare, the Black Mage, has transcended Final Fantasy. Sephiroth is the Final Fantasy villain. He's the one-winged angel. He's in Smash, for heaven's sakes. He's canonically met Steve, and when taking into consideration the story segment of Midgar, he would show up at the tail end, do one thing, and then disappear. We knew that wasn't gonna cut it. Sephiroth is too important to the legacy of Final Fantasy VII that his presence in the first part of this remake was entirely expected and very necessary. And the first chance the game has to introduce him, they take it. Then he shows up here. Then he shows up there. He's mentioned in passing, yet nobody wants to speak of him. Cloud's head hurts when his name is spoken. He has painful memories of him and Tifa, some kind of accident that we aren't really told about. Sephiroth's physical presence in his scenes is always up for debate, because he's presumed dead, yet appearing and disappearing seemingly at will. He's treated like a specter, a ghost of Cloud and Tifa's past. Something unfathomable, an unanswered riddle. And that's kind of how he remains. Despite his expanded presence in the Midgar section of the story, we don't really know who Sephiroth is. As a new player who never played the original, but obviously knowing of Sephiroth simply by living in the world and owning an internet-accessible device, he would be terrifying here. This remake does so right by Sephiroth. They expand his presence because it was absolutely necessary for this act of the story to function by itself. But it also leaves him so mysterious and unexplained that the expanded presence won't negatively affect what he has to do in the future entries. He's so separated from everything else that's going on in the story. His simple existence in a scene is enough to make it questionable from an objective standpoint. He's just freaky. He's scary. Sephiroth as a villain in the Final Fantasy VII Remake is impactful because of the masterful way that they managed him in regards to his long-standing legacy. And that's kind of the truth behind the whole game, isn't it? There will never be another game like the Final Fantasy VII Remake, because there will never be another legacy like Final Fantasy VII, especially not one that calls for a remake as expansive and grand as this one. And since it's now already been done, if that rumored remake of 9 follows a similar pattern to 7R, it'll be awesome and hype as heck, but not the same. 7R is unreplicable, even when compared to the rest of the entries yet to release. I am sure of that. It doesn't matter if they're better or worse, whether or not this game is deeply flawed to its core. Nothing will ever recapture the feeling of when this game hit the shelves and we realized just what the dev team had accomplished.
And I think that today I've given a good handful of reasons as to why that is.
I have Final Fantasy VII on the brain right now. I can't stop thinking about it. It's in my dreams, and I think I'm in love with every character. Maybe I should go back and finally finish the original. However, I never finished 16, and Rebirth is right around the corner, and I need to finish all of those Switch games from last year. Someday, you will be loved. Oh! Pizza's here!